The wind howled through the empty streets of Porter, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes that danced and swirled under the pale glow of the street lamps. Raymond Winters stumbled down the sidewalk, his coat pulled tight against the biting cold, his eyes red and swollen from a mix of tears and the sting of the icy wind. "Monica!" he shouted, his voice ragged and hoarse. "Monica, where are you?" But there was no reply, only the mournful whistle of the wind and the crunch of fresh snow beneath his boots. Raymond paused under a street lamp, leaning heavily against the frozen metal pole as he fought to catch his breath. He retrieved his pocket watch from his coat with trembling fingers.
2:34 nachts.
His daughter had been missing for over 12 hours now. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Monica was a good girl, a responsible girl. She would never just wander off or skip school. Raymond had walked her to the schoolhouse doors himself that morning, watched her skip inside with her blonde pigtails bouncing and her blue eyes sparkling. She had hugged him tight and planted a kiss on his stubbly cheek. "Bye, Daddy. See you after school." But when Raymond had returned that afternoon to walk her home, Monica was nowhere to be found. The teacher, Mrs. Larkin, swore she had never arrived at school that day at all. Raymond had argued vehemently. He knew what he had seen. He had held Monica's hand, kissed her goodbye, but the school had no record of her attendance. Frantic, Raymond contacted the police, but they seemed skeptical of his story. They promised to look into it, but he could see in their eyes that they considered him just another hysterical parent overreacting to a child's truancy. Defeated, Raymond had retreated to his empty house to wait for word, downing whiskey to quell his racing thoughts. As the hours ticked by with no news, he had grown more and more agitated, pacing the confines of his study like a caged animal. His mind raced with horrible scenarios: kidnapping, foul play, his little girl hurt and crying for her daddy. By nightfall, he couldn't bear the oppressive silence any longer. He had to go out and search for Monica himself. Now here he was, alone in the frigid darkness, no closer to finding his precious daughter. With a groan, Raymond pushed off from the lamppost and resumed his hopeless trek. "Monica!" he called again, his voice small and feeble against the roar of the wind. "Please, honey, come home to Daddy." Suddenly, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. His heart leapt into his throat. Monica! There, across the street, he glimpsed a small figure in a blue dress darting behind a hedge. Raymond sprinted forward, slipping on a patch of ice and nearly tumbling to the frozen concrete. He righted himself and pushed onward, following the sound of laughter and the flash of blonde hair through the maze of hedges and fences as the figure stayed maddeningly out of reach. "Monica, stop! It's Daddy!" he shouted desperately, but still the figure danced ahead of him, always just out of sight. The chase took him deeper into town, down alleyways and around corners he scarcely recognized in the whiteout conditions. All the while the wind roared and tugged at Raymond, as if trying to impede his pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, Raymond found himself standing at the mouth of a dead-end alley, gasping for air, his face numb from the cold. The laughter had ceased, but he knew Monica was here. He could feel it in his bones. "Monica, sweetheart, come out," he called between panting breaths, taking a cautious step forward. "Daddy's here now. Everything's going to be okay." Squinting against the darkness, he could just make out a small, crumpled form on the ground ahead. His racing heart stuttered in his chest. "Monica?" he whispered, pushing forward on unsteady legs. The shape was unmoving, deathly still. "No. Please God, no." Raymond fell to his knees beside the tiny body, a sob tearing from his throat as he gathered his daughter into his arms. She was so cold, her skin like ice against his. Her blue dress was in tatters, her bare arms covered in gashes and ugly purple bruises. Worst of all, her eyes, her beautiful blue eyes that had once sparkled with such life and joy, stared vacantly into the falling snow, glazed and empty. "My baby?" Raymond sobbed, cradling Monica's lifeless form against his heaving chest. "Oh God, my baby!" He sat like that for an eternity, heedless of the snow and wind, until the crunch of approaching footsteps finally drew his attention. He looked up to see his old friend Martin standing over him, his face a mask of horror in the harsh beam of a flashlight. "Raymond? What?" Martin's words seemed to fail him as his eyes fell upon Monica's battered body. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Is that? How can this be?" "She's gone, Martin," Raymond choked out. Some monster. They killed my little girl." The blare of sirens sent up an unholy racket in the once tranquil cul-de-sac as police cars and an ambulance skidded to a halt in front of the Winters home, their tires kicking up plumes of gray slush. Officers dashed for the front door, ready to apprehend Raymond for suspicion of foul play against his daughter. What they found inside defied all reason and expectation. Raymond sat handcuffed on his living room sofa, face streaked with tears but otherwise placid and compliant. Beside him, a female officer was draping a shock blanket over the trembling shoulders of Martin Walsh. Most startling of all was the sight in the middle of the room: Monica Winters, very much alive, clutching a steaming mug of cocoa as an EMT checked her vitals. "Will someone please explain what the hell is going on here?" demanded the lead detective as he stormed in, his voice booming in the sudden hush. "Detective Novak, I'm telling you, it's a miracle," Martin sputtered, rising unsteadily to his feet. I saw her. Monica. She was dead. In the alley." "You're not making any sense, Walsh," Novak snapped. He turned to Raymond. "Mr. Winters, we received a frantic call from your friend here claiming you had found your daughter deceased, but she appears to be in perfect health. Care to clear this up for us?" Raymond lifted his head slowly, his eyes distant and glassy. I thought, I was so sure I found her body," he whispered hoarsely. "But when Martin brought me home, there she was, sitting on the couch in her pajamas like nothing ever happened. I don't understand." Novak pinched the bridge of his nose and heaved a sigh. None of this added up. The girl showed no signs of physical trauma or distress, despite her father's claims of finding her corpse beaten in an alley. Was it all some sort of elaborate, alcohol-fueled delusion? He turned back to Martin. "You said you saw the body too. You're certain she was dead? Not breathing? No pulse?" Martin opened his mouth as if to confirm it, but then froze, his brow knitting in sudden doubt. I thought I checked, but it was so cold and I was in such shock." He shook his head as if to clear it. "Maybe I was mistaken. Monica, sweetheart, you're okay, aren't you? You were here safe all along." Monica glanced between the adults, her young face a mix of confusion and apprehension. I don't remember," she murmured. "I was walking to school and then I woke up in my bed. I don't know what happened in between." She set her cocoa aside and went to her father, climbing into his lap and burrowing against his chest. Raymond wrapped his arms around her and started to sob. "I'm just glad you're safe," he said roughly. "My God, when I thought I lost you." Novak watched the reunion with a mix of relief and unease. He should just close the books on this and write it off as a false alarm, an overwrought father's drunken nightmare. But he couldn't shake the sense that something darker was at play. Call it policing instinct, but the whole scene felt staged, contrived, like an illusionist's trick, all flash and smoke. He caught Martin's eye and saw his own reservations mirrored there. There was more to this story. He could feel it in his bones. The people of Porter didn't take well to unsolved mysteries. Their town was too small, their lives too rigorously predictable to suffer vagaries of the unknown. When the official line came down that Monica Winters was safe and sound, and there was no foul play to investigate, folks heaved a sigh of relief and went back to their quotidian routines. But the questions lingered as stubbornly as a bitter aftertaste. What really happened that blustery winter night? Did Raymond and Martin experience some kind of shared delusion spurred by grief and drink? Or was it some sort of twisted prank to garner attention? Only the two men knew the truth of what they had seen, and neither was eager to dwell on that truth. After his close call with the law, Raymond retreated into his home and himself. He answered the door for no one, not even Martin. He was spotted only on his infrequent supply runs into town, a twitchy ghost of his former self, jumping at shadows. He fortified his property with surveillance cameras and bright floodlights, as if expecting trouble. He pulled Monica out of school in favor of homeschooling. Tongues wagged, of course. The prevailing theory was that Raymond, already a broken man after his wife's death, had finally snapped and lost his grip on reality that frigid night in the alley. Perhaps, they whispered, he had done something unspeakable to Monica in his madness, and her miraculous return was just a desperate ploy to cover his tracks. Martin knew better, even as a part of him wished he could believe that tidy explanation. But the sickening weight of Monica's lifeless body in his arms, the vacant marbled sheen of her eyes, the awful blue tint of her lips and fingernails, it defied all logic or rationalization. Something truly eldritch had transpired in that alley, something his mind shied from like a panicked horse. So Martin coped the only way he knew how: he drank. He spent his days in a pickle brine haze down at McCafferty's pub, exchanging only the barest of pleasantries with the other patrons. He knew they pitied him, clucked their tongues at how that grim business with the Winters girl had driven him to the bottle. Good, upstanding Martin Walsh laid so low. If they only knew the half of it. At night, alone in his modest bachelor's bungalow, Martin's thoughts invariably circled back to the alley. He pored over every excruciating detail of those awful moments, the unnatural chill radiating from Monica's prone form, the impossible absence of blood or bruising on her deathly pale skin, the way the falling snow seemed to evaporate before ever touching her. It was as if she had been frozen in time at the very instant of death, preserved unchanging. What could explain it? Some heretofore unknown medical affliction? An act of divine intervention or demonic force? Martin wasn't a superstitious man by nature, but faced with the sheer uncanniness of what he had experienced, his mind spun with the impossible. He might have lost himself completely to the bottle and madness if not for the unexpected lifeline thrown to him 3 months after that fateful night. It arrived in the form of a plain manila envelope shoved unceremoniously through his mail slot. Inside was a single sheet of office paper. The top bore an official-looking letterhead with an embossed eagle seal. The Methuselah Institute, Dr. Lionel Horace, Executive Director. Below was a brief typed message. Mr. Walsh, it has come to our attention that you may have borne witness to an atemporal event on the night of November 17th. Given the highly sensitive nature of such occurrences, we strongly advise discretion on your part. However, we also understand you may be experiencing significant psychological distress as a result of your exposure and require assistance contextualizing your experience. If you wish to learn more, come to the below address this Thursday at 8 p.m. Tell no one of this letter or your destination. We will provide the answers you seek, but be warned, with knowledge comes burden. The truth you uncover may offer you peace of mind, but at the cost of your blissful ignorance. The choice is yours. Elash. Below was an address located on the far outskirts of town, in an area dominated by abandoned farms and fallow fields. Martin recognized it as the site of the old Briar Glen sleepaway camp, though he thought that place had closed down decades ago. He read and reread the cryptic note a dozen times, searching for any hint of a hoax or trick. But there was something about the somber, officious wording and the feel of the paper, infused with a distinctive metallic tang, that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with eerie portent. An atemporal event? He was far from certain what that could mean, but the very term seemed to crackle with eldritch energy that set his every nerve alight. Was it possible there was some greater explanation for the uncanny scene in the alley? Did this Dr. Horace truly have the answers he sought, however unsettling? Martin knew he should just destroy the letter and put the whole sordid business behind him once and for all. But even as he struck a match and held the flame under a corner of the paper, he couldn't bring himself to let it catch. His hand shook until the match burned down to his fingertips and he dropped it with a hiss. He needed to know, needed to understand what impossible force had torn asunder the very laws of nature that night and left a little girl suspended between life and death. perhaps this Methuselah Institute was just the ramblings of some crackpot with an overactive imagination. But if there was even a chance that someone out there held the key to the mystery that had devoured his waking thoughts and haunted his dreams these long months, Martin folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. He would go to the prescribed meeting place on Thursday night. Come what may, blissful ignorance be damned. The truth, however terrible, was the only remaining salve for his fractured psyche. What he could never know was that he had just set his feet irrevocably on a path into deeper darkness than his wildest nightmares could fathom, and that the truth awaiting him would make that awful night in the alley seem tame by comparison.